Last week, for those of you who are here, we covered the Beatitudes, the eight kind of blessings of what it means to live a good life according to God. And so today we're going to continue on the part of Jesus' sermon right after that. So we're going to just cover these short verses 13 through 16. And so I'll just go ahead and read it for us. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. And so here Jesus begins the part that we're going to cover by just proclaiming the things that we as Christians are, right? Verse 13, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. And so I don't know what your response is when you hear these words of Jesus. You might be intimidated. You might say, whoa, Jesus, you're the light of the world, not me. You're the one who came to save us. And how can I take on this kind of identity? And so we might even want to, out of our fear, push back against Jesus or push back against this identity of ourselves. And so as we kind of think about that response, Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth. In other words, you are my representative. And if you think about what he's saying here, that's just reality, right? That's just simply true. Soon as you identify yourselves as a Christian, and people ask you, are you a Christian? You say, as soon as you say, I am a Christian, then you are representing Christ, like it or not. At that point, it becomes a matter of, are you a good representative or are you a poor representative? But either way, you are a representative of Christ. And think about what is the alternative if you're a Christian. If you're not going to be a representative, then what is the alternative? What other options do you have? Are you going to just kind of try to blend in with the rest of the world as long as you can until you die and go to heaven? Is that sort of your way of trying to live as a Christian while you're here on earth until Jesus takes you to heaven? I don't think so. I don't think that's how any of us should try to live out our Christian life. And in fact, elsewhere in the Bible, there's some pretty strong words of what our identity is. Apostle Paul says in Romans 1, 14 and 15, I am under obligation both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. And so here he uses this very strong word, I am under obligation. I owe a debt. I'm responsible to Greeks and to barbarians, which means basically everybody, because in their mind, anybody who is not a Greek, they said is a barbarian. So basically to everybody, I have this obligation to preach the gospel, as he says later on in chapter 1. So I know that we live in a culture where any kind of pressure is considered negative. Like, oh, don't pressure me. I don't like to feel pressure and all of that. And let's kind of think about that mentality. What would you think of parents who don't want that pressure to take care of their infant, right? Like they have a newborn child, their mom and dad, the baby needs a lot of help, right? They need milk, they need to be changed their diapers, to be bathed. And what if a parent says, oh, I don't like that pressure. Don't pressure me. Don't pressure me to be a good dad. And so what if, I don't know who this guy is. I just Googled parents. But let's say this guy says, I don't like this pressure. So he takes a picture, like this nice picture. He sends it to his parents. But the next moment, he's gone. And let's say, where's he gone to? He hit the road. And he says, I didn't like to feel that pressure. I didn't like that restriction. So I wanted freedom. And so he becomes, from a programmer here, I'm just making this up. He's a programmer here, and he says, I'm going to be a truck driver. And so he says, I'm going to just make a living, and I want to be out on the open roads. So he hits the freeway. And the rest of his life, I want to just be free to be wherever I want to go, up and down the coast, east, west. I want to be free. And I want to be true to be me. And what if he reacted that way and we rejected this pressure? Then do we applaud him and say, good for you? You're being true to yourself. You know, you're not allowing the world to pressure you. We would say, no, you're a jerk. You're a scoundrel. You have an infant to take care of. You walked out on your wife. You walked out on your kid just because you didn't want that pressure. And so not all pressure is negative. Some pressure is good for us. It ennobles us. It lifts us up to be better than we would be left to our own desires. And so here, when Paul says, I'm under obligation to preach the gospel, I'm under obligation to be salt and light, that's a good thing. Now, one pastor that I was listening to, he used this analogy to describe what a typical Christian does in America. And I thought it really captured it really well. So he says, you know, you go to a football game and you know, like here's the Patriots, one of my favorite teams, so you know, a local team here. And so I think football tickets are really expensive now, maybe $200? Does anybody know? Like $200, okay? So let's say you decide, I'm going to go see the Patriots play. So I'm going to spend $200. And you go there, and then they huddle like this, right? Because I mean, that's what they do before the play. And so let's say they huddle like this, but they don't huddle for just 10 seconds. They don't huddle for just 30 seconds. They keep huddling. They keep talking. And then a whole hour, they're talking like this. And then when the hour is done, they just run off the field. And that's the end of the game. And you go, what in the world? I got ripped off. I paid $100, I paid $200 to see them play football. But all they're doing is just talking about football, talking about what potential plays we could run. But they don't play a single play. And so this pastor used this as an analogy to what Christians do in America throughout the country. He said Christians are great at gathering at churches like this. And they come and they gather for an hour and they talk and they talk. And the pastor talks and talks about Christianity, about the gospel. And then rest of the week, they don't play anything. They don't put their action into the Christianity into action. They don't carry out, I am under obligation to the Greeks and to barbarians to be salt and light. They just talk about Christianity. And he said that is as absurd as these football players who are huddling, but they refuse to do anything. Now, going back to the salt and light text that we had covered, or that we read earlier, I would like for you to talk about what are the traits and functions of salt? Like, you know, what is salt used for? What is salt like? And same with the light, because this is what the metaphor that Jesus uses in this text. So please go ahead and discuss that for just a couple of minutes, okay? Okay, I'm going to ask you to wrap up your discussion, please. Okay, so I'm not sure what you guys came up with in terms of common traits or traits of salt and light, but one commonality I think that I'm sure that you guys would have come up is that the way that both salt and light work is that they are very distinct, right? In other words, they have to be very different from all the way from what's around them. Otherwise, you wouldn't even taste the salt. You wouldn't notice the light is there. And so just kind of applying this to one way is a purpose for life, right? If you think about what is our purpose for life, and if you were to sort of think about what our world says should be our purpose for life in terms of decades, what do you think that would be? So, in terms of, let's say when you're in your teens, the world would says, have a good time with your friends. You're just preparing for the future. Maybe experiment a lot. Be sexually, just do whatever you want with yourself. And that life is all about getting experience as much as possible. And so maybe that's kind of the world's vision for our teenage years. Okay, so what about then in our next decade, in our 20s? So you start college, many of you right now are in that season of life. You're supposed to make lifelong friends. You're supposed to figure out your career and kind of get yourself ready for the rest of your life, says the world. And then the rest of 20s, it's exciting, right? You get your first job. Maybe later on you get married. You have your first child. You start your family. And so far, man, the world's vision for our lives every decade seems pretty good. Seems different and exciting and changing all the time. So this is the 20s. Well, what about our 30s? So then if you play your cards right, you save up enough and you get a house for your family, that picture that I showed you. And then you have a car for yourself and for your wife. So this is your vision your idealized vision of the world for our 30s. What's our world's vision for our 40s? Can you guess? Upgrade that house, right? Upgrade that car to a little bit nicer car. Before that was a Toyota whatever, and now this is a Kia something, okay? But you get the point. So this is the world's vision for our 40s. What's our world's vision for our 50s? A bigger house. Upgrade that home. Upgrade to even a bigger car, a nice SUV. What is our world's vision for the decade after that, our 70s? Go into a nice, luxurious, convalescent home where all of your needs will be met. 70s, 80s, maybe 90s if you live long enough. What is our world's vision after that? Buy yourself a nice plot in a cemetery, right? That's it. That's the world's most exciting vision for our lives in decades. Now, for us to be salt and light, we don't just simply follow what the world says and says, yeah, I'll follow that plan. Think about how repetitive it was, right? Especially this part, right? It's so repetitive. We're supposed to say, no, I'm supposed to be salt. I'm supposed to be light. I'm supposed to stand out. I'm supposed to be different. Not just follow what the world says I'm going to do every decade. And the way that you and I could really stand out is by saying, I'm not going to follow this plan. And as Christians, we have something a lot more exciting for a purpose for our life than simply upgrade that car, upgrade that house. Next decade, again, upgrade that house, upgrade that car, upgrade that house, upgrade that car. We have this gospel that can give people eternal life. What Jack shared, right? As soon as he became a Christian as a freshman, man, I have this gospel. Now I have to share it with my parents, with my grandparents, with my uncles and aunties. Nobody else in my family knows the gospel. And he didn't make his life just simply following the decade by decade plan that the world says, Jack, you got to do this. You're a young guy. You should follow this plan. And I look at my life, and I think my life is very different than this. I'm now in my young 50s, I can say that. I know to you like 50s. How can you say young 50s? That's an oxymoron. But no, I'm in my young 50s. I'm 52, going on 53. Yeah. So I'm in my young 50s, and my life is not following this. Right now, all of my worldly goods it fits in one bedroom in a townhome in Fairfax somewhere. And I don't know what my late 50s is going to hold. And we're not upgrading our car. We used to have 2 cars, and now we're going to downgrade to 1 car because we're always together, my wife and I, like 99% of the time. We don't need a second car. And so we're not trying to upgrade our home. We're not trying to upgrade our cars. But the kind of life that we get to live as Christians, I wouldn't exchange it for any of this. No way. And I think the life that I live is so much more fulfilling, is so much more rich than anything that this world can offer. And so I want to ask you, I know that you're still young, you're still in your 20s, but how distinct is your purpose for life? How distinct is it from the tried and true, the repetitive, boring plan that the world sets out for young people like you? How distinct is it? Because that's what being salt and light is all about. Now, I think another aspect about salt is this, that even a little bit is disproportionate in terms of how much it could influence the surroundings, right? So you put just a little bit of salt, and I've done this before, and I'm sure some of you have done this too. You put a little bit of salt in a cup of coffee, and right away, it's like, oh man, what did I do? I thought it was sugar, but I put salt in, and it could be just a little one dash of salt. It makes a huge impact. That's what salt does. And historically, that's what Christians have done. You think about Jesus giving Sermon on the Mount. The Christians in the world is just that audience right in front of him. And those Christians have disproportionately influenced and changed the rest of the world. And it should be true of Christians today. I think another way in which, now going to the light aspect, the way that light works, the way the light influences the environment, is that there's a drastic contrast between light and no light. Now, we don't get that just living in like Boston because we're just surrounded by light. Even at night, right? They're just surrounded by light. But if you ever found yourself in a pitch black kind of nature, right? Where there's no moonlight even, you know that even a little bit of light makes a huge difference, right? It's so distinct. It's such contrast with the surroundings. So I think my favorite story with this is not my own, but it's Pastor Daniel Kim, one of our pastors in Berkeley. And he tells this really memorable story. So he said that one Saturday they were on this beautiful trip to Yosemite, right? So they had like 40, 50 students. They went up on Vernal Falls, and they were overlooking Yosemite Valley. It's beautiful. And as they were hiking down, they paused on that trail to admire the beautiful sunset. And in Yosemite Valley, for those of you who've been there, it's amazing. And especially during sunset, the colors that gets highlighted as the sun is setting. And so they all just stopped and admired the sunset. And then they realized, oh shoot, the sun is setting. It's a sunset. And they still had a long way to go before they make it down to the valley. And so then they began to run. But then it was too late. By then, and it's in a valley, so the sun sets really quickly there. And soon, he said, it became pitch black. So black that you couldn't even tell when you blinked. Did I blink or did I not blink? Because it makes no difference, because it's so dark. And so he is leading this group of 40, 50 students down the hiking trail where it's pitch black. Thankfully, he had in his pocket this, which probably none of you guys remember, but your parents would remember this. It was before cell phones and smartphones. It was called the Palm Pilot, and you would stick this in your pocket, and it would be like this. You keep your calendar and all of those things. And then if you turn on this Palm Pilot, he said, and you shine it right near the ground, you could barely see. Oh, this is a rock and not dirt, right? And so through this Palm Pilot, they somehow made it down that Yosemite hiking trail. And what a story, right? And that through that, he really appreciated, boy, light is precious. And light is powerful and precious because it is distinct. when you're surrounded by darkness. And so I think that tells us that as Christians, it's not a matter of sheer number, right? You may be the only Christian in your family, Jack's story. You may be the only Christian in your dorm. You may be the only Christian in your class. But it's not a matter of sheer number. By being distinct, you can still have an influence. And so how can we be distinct from those around us? Well, I think one way that we can be distinct is live out, like the Beatitudes that we talked about last Sunday. If you are to genuinely and sincerely live your life according to the Beatitudes, being poor in spirit, hungering and thirst for righteousness, being meek before God, you are going to be different. And all the things that we're going to continue to learn about in the rest of the Sermon on the Mount. Now, in verses 13 and 15, Jesus talks about these very interesting salt. And he talks about a very interesting use of lamp. He says, if you have salt, but it lost its saltiness, so you can't taste it anymore, or if you take a lamp, and instead of putting it on a high place so that it can shine the whole room, you put it under a basket, he says, what would happen? And so let me ask you to talk about what does it look like for a Christian to live a life that would be something like losing its saltiness? What does it look like for a Christian to be a light that is hidden under a basket? So please go ahead and discuss this with the people around you. Okay, if you could please go ahead and wrap up. Now, Jesus uses very strong words here, talking about the salt that has lost its saltiness. And by the way, in his culture, the Dead Sea, there would be some salt, but it would be so mixed in with impurities. It's basically salt that has lost its saltiness. And so he says of that kind of salt, he uses some pretty strong words. It's no longer good for anything. It just needs to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. And it makes sense, right? Because if the salt has lost its saltiness, what use is that, right? It's like a watch that no longer keeps time. What use is that? You can go on and on. What use is a pen that doesn't write, and so forth. It's totally useless. And so Jesus uses the same thing for the picture of the lamp. Now, how does this apply to us? And I think you might have come up with it as you were discussing this, but it's the Christian who decides, I'm going to be a secret agent Christian, right? Nobody's going to know my identity as a Christian. I'm going to do my best disguise, pretending that I'm a Christian, so that nobody will ever suspect that I'm a Christian. Like, wow, she's a Christian? I had no idea. And so a lot of us, I think, especially here in America, really do our best impersonation of a secret agent Christian. And I want to share with you Jim Elliot's words when he wrote these words when he was 17 years old. So he's in high school, and he's writing these words to his younger sister. So I think she must have been 14, 13. And he says this, Jane, begin each day with a private reading of the word and prayer. John Bunyan said, sin will keep you from this book, or this book will keep you from sin. Give out gospel tracts to those you meet on the way to school, and make a bold start at the beginning of high school. It's easier that way than later. And memorize scripture on your rides to and from school. Redeem the time, Jane. Time is costly because it is so fleeting. Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved. And by the way, if you don't know who Jim Elliot is, he didn't just tell his sister to do this. He actually did this himself. And later on, he died as a missionary to Ecuador, trying to share the gospel with the Native Americans there. And then he got speared to death in his attempt to do that. But I want to just highlight those words that I bolded there. So I guess his sister was about to start high school. He says, make a bold start at the beginning of high school. It's easier that way than later. Good advice. And that would be my advice to you. Unless you really want to be a secret agent Christian, my advice to you is whenever you enter a new social circle, a new classroom, a new dorm floor, a new job, just make a bold start. From day one, make it clear, hey, I'm a Christian. I mean, you don't have to be obnoxious about it or rude about it, but just bring it up. I'm a Christian. It's so much better that way than 6 months keep it a secret, and then by the way, I'm a Christian, and like, what, really? You could have fooled me. I had no idea you were a Christian, right? Just from day one, make a bold start. It's much easier that way than later on. Now, when we read these words, going back to what I said in the beginning, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. We read these words, and it seems very intimidating to us, doesn't it? And I think typically, as in America, we tend to take these words very individualistically, if there's such a word. But Jesus is not saying you singular. In the Greek, it's you all are the salt of the earth. You all are the light of the world. And that makes sense. Like, how can I, solo Christian, somehow be the embodiment of the gospel? It's really hard. It's really tough. But I, with my fellow brothers and sisters in this community, in this church, yeah, together we can be salt of the earth. We can be this distinct community that shows Jesus' light. And furthermore, thinking about this as a communal identity shows that it's not about you being this awesome Christian. It's not about you being this super spiritual person that just wherever you go, there's this glow. And like, wow, you're salt and you're light because, man, there's this glow about you. No, it's about us being this authentic community that cares for one another, that serves one another, that really embodies the love of Christ. And then you all, then together, are salt of the earth, light of the world, as Jesus is telling us. It makes sense. Now, as far as the function of the light, he says, in the same way, let your light shine before others, and through good works, that they may see it and give glory to the Father who is in heaven. Now, some people take this verse, some Christians take this verse, and they say, you know what, I'm going to just let my life do the talking. And those kind of Christians love to quote St. Francis of Assisi, who was supposedly said these words, preach the gospel, if necessary, use words. How many of you have heard this before? Right? I think Christians quote this a lot. Now, the problem with this is he never said it. He never said it. So if you think about, if you search his writings that remain, his disciples writing about what their teacher taught him, he never said it. The closest thing he said was to his preachers, to his disciples, when you go and proclaim the gospel, you better make sure that your life matches your words. And in fact, Francis of Assisi himself was one of these people who would share the gospel. He would go from village to village, sometimes 5 towns on a given day. So he was like the Billy Graham of his day. And so he never said this. And so Greg Stier of Dare to Share has a twist on his words, and he says, share the gospel, it's necessary, and use words, right? And so, yeah, as Christians, we're called to share the gospel. Yes, our life and our actions better match, but we are to use both. Our life in such a way, the loving life, the serving life, that universally everybody can recognize, wow, that's something very distinct about you, as well as our words. That's how we can shine the light of the gospel. And I want to just share with you an example from a book that I read of Earl Palmer, who was a pastor of a church called First Presbyterian Church in UC Berkeley. And I actually attended that church as a freshman. And he wrote this book. And he, in this book, recollects a conversation he had with one of the UC Berkeley students. And this student, before he became a Christian, was full of skepticism and doubts and questions about Christianity. And knowing this about him, later on when he became a Christian, he said, hey, what gives? How did you become a Christian? Because I know your background. You used to be very skeptical about Christianity and all of that. And so what changed? How did you become changed? And he said, oh, Pastor Palmer, I'll tell you what tipped the scales for me. He said, so there was a time where he became really sick. He had like the flu for like 2 weeks. So for 2 weeks, he couldn't go to classes and things like that. And, this is back in the days before internet. Nobody posted videos online of the lectures and things like that. But he had this friend who just on his own, and he described it without any fanfare, gathered all of the notes from his classes for during those 2 weeks. And he spent his own time that he could have been studying catching up his friend in those 2 weeks of school lectures that he missed. And of that friend, he said this, this kind of thing just isn't done. I wanted to know what made this guy act the way that he did. I even found myself asking if I could go to church with him because he was a Christian. And then of this friend, he says, I felt more alive when I was around this friend. And so this is what it means to be salt and light. And, if you think about that whole metaphor of light and salt that Jesus uses here, in a way, it gets consumed, right? You put the salt in a soup, it dissolves, it gets consumed. Back in the light that he's talking about, a lamp, it's an oil lamp. And so as that lamp is burning, that oil is being consumed. And in order for us to be salt and light, we have to be willing to be consumed. We have to be willing to say, let my life be consumed in this way so that I can be salt and light to my friends, to my family members. Now, this is not easy. And there's going to be times where you say, I don't want my life to be consumed. But this friend that reached out to this guy that Earl Palmer was talking about, he's a picture of this. His life is being consumed. His own resources, his own time that he could be studying, his own classes, he's letting it being consumed so that he can be salt and light to his friend. Now, I want to just wrap up by saying this. Some of you, as you're listening to this, you're saying, okay, Pastor Timothy, I'm convinced. Jesus is calling me to be salt and light. I'm convinced that this is my obligation. But truth be told, I know that it's not just up to me. That there are so many other Christians here in America. There's so many other Christians here at church So it's not up to me. And I'm going to depend on them to be salt and light because Jesus said, you all are salt and light. And that is true. But what else is true? Okay? What else is true? What else is true is you can't read this because it's red. Okay, let me try another color. Is that better? Yeah, okay. What else is true is that here is you. I'm not a good drawer, sorry. And you're a Christian. And there are people in your life that God has placed in the sphere of your influence. They're your family members, they're your close friends, and so you can influence them. And yeah, there are other Christians out here, but somehow, just through life circumstances, they don't have the influence that you do upon these people. You are unique in that you can be salt and light to them. It's like exactly what Jack shared in his testimony. His parents, his grandparents. Yeah, he can say, well, there must be millions of other Christians in China. Let them be salt and light. Yeah, it might be true there's other million Christians in China, but they're not in this sphere with them as he is with his parents and with his grandparents. I remember one of our church members in Berkeley, his name is John Lin. He was once, him and Kelly, his wife, were missionaries to a Central Asia country that was predominantly Muslim country. And while he was there, he was teaching English, and that was his way to sort of build relationships with the people there. And then every day, he said he would take the list of the students in his class, and he would pray for their salvation. And he said that prayer time would go really fast. He said he never got tired of praying for those people because those were the people that he said, I knew that there's nobody else in the world who is praying for their salvation. I'm it. And if I'm not praying for their salvation, there's nobody else. And so he found himself very sincerely, and the time would go as he's praying each of them by name. So who are the people in your circle? And if you are not salt and light to those people, what will happen to them? Conversely, what could happen if you decide to be, I'm going to be salt. I'm going to be light, just like what Jack shared, and just like that student that Pastor Earl Palmer shared at his church. Imagine what could happen to these people if you choose to embrace that identity as salt and light. And how wonderful it could be if they could become Christians and then they have their own circle around them. And so let's go ahead and spend some time just praying, and maybe you can write down your personal response to today's message. But what has been your personal response to the calling to be salt and light? And what are ways that you can spend yourself in order to embrace that identity? And just pray and ask for God's help to become the most potent salt and light that you can be. So let's spend some time just personally responding to today's message, and then we'll have the band come up and lead us in our closing song.